What's up, everyone? Daniel Davis here. And listen, I need you to stop scrolling right now because what just happened in New Mexico is absolutely massive. We're talking about sweeping gun control laws that could change everything for millions of Americans. And honestly, this might be the beginning of something way bigger than just one state. If you're a teenager, a young adult, or you just care about your rights and what's happening in this country, you need to hear this. So buckle up. This is going to be intense. All right, let's dive straight into it. New Mexico just passed some of the most aggressive gun control legislation we've seen in years. I'm talking comprehensive, sweeping changes that touch nearly every aspect of gun ownership, possession, and use in the state. And here's the thing, this didn't just come out of nowhere. This has been brewing for months, fueled by public pressure, political debate, and some tragic events that shook communities to their core. So what are we actually talking about here? Let me break it down for you piece by piece because the details matter a lot. First, New Mexico has introduced universal background checks for all gun sales. And I mean all gun sales. Private sales, gun show sales, transfers between family members, everything. Before this, you could buy a gun from a private seller without going through the same rigorous background check process required at licensed dealers. Now, that loophole is closed. Every single transaction has to go through a federally licensed dealer who runs a background check through the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System, also known as NICS. Why does this matter? Well, according to recent studies, roughly 22% of gun owners in the United States acquired their most recent firearm without a background check. That's more than 1 in 5. Closing that gap is a huge deal, and proponents argue it's a critical step toward keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. Convicted felons, domestic abusers, people with severe mental health issues. Critics, on the other hand, say this infringes on Second Amendment rights and creates unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles for law-abiding citizens. Second, red flag laws. New Mexico has now empowered law enforcement and family members to petition a court for what's called an extreme risk protection order. Basically, if someone is showing signs of being a danger to themselves or others, a judge can temporarily remove their firearms. We're talking about situations where someone is making credible threats, exhibiting violent behavior, or showing serious mental health crises. Here's where it gets controversial. These orders can be issued before someone commits a crime. That's right. It's a preventative measure. Supporters say this could save lives, citing examples from states like California and Florida, where red flag laws have been credited with preventing potential mass shootings and suicides. But opponents argue this violates due process rights. They say, how can you take away someone's constitutional rights based on what they might do? It's a fair question, and it's sparking massive debate. Third, waiting periods. New Mexico has instituted a mandatory 7-day waiting period for all firearm purchases. You can't just walk into a store, pass a background check, and walk out with a gun the same day anymore. You have to wait a full week. The logic here is simple. Cooling off periods. Data shows that many impulsive acts of violence, especially suicides, could potentially be prevented if there's a delay between deciding to acquire a gun and actually getting one. Studies from states with waiting periods show a correlation with reduced gun deaths, particularly suicides, which account for nearly 60% of all gun deaths in America. But again, critics say this is just another barrier that doesn't actually stop criminals who aren't getting their guns through legal channels anyway. Fourth, safe storage laws. This one's huge, especially for families. New Mexico now requires gun owners to store their firearms in a locked container or with a trigger lock when not in use, particularly if minors could access them. Failure to do so, especially if a minor gains access and causes harm, can result in serious criminal penalties. Why? Because accidental shootings involving children are tragically common. The CDC reports that in 2020 alone, over 350 children aged 0 to 17 died from accidental firearm injuries. That's nearly one child every single day. Safe storage laws aim to prevent these heartbreaking tragedies. Fifth, assault weapon restrictions, and high-capacity magazine bans. New Mexico has now banned the sale, transfer, and possession of what they define as assault-style weapons and magazines holding more than 10 rounds. This is probably the most controversial part of the entire package. Supporters point to mass shootings where high-capacity magazines allowed shooters to fire dozens of rounds without reloading, leading to higher casualty counts. They argue that limiting access to these weapons and magazines can reduce the lethality of such attacks. Opponents, however, say terms like assault weapon are vague and politically motivated, that these firearms are functionally identical to many legal hunting rifles, and that law-abiding gun owners use them responsibly for sport shooting and self-defense. So that's the rundown. 5 major changes: universal background checks, red flag laws, waiting periods, safe storage requirements, assault weapon, and high-capacity magazine bans. This is a complete overhaul of New Mexico's gun laws, and it's happening right now. Okay, so now you're probably wondering, why? Why now? Why New Mexico? Great questions. Let's dig into the context, because understanding the why is just as important as understanding the what. First off, New Mexico has been dealing with rising gun violence. I'm talking significant increases in homicides, suicides, and accidental shootings over the past several years. According to the CDC, New Mexico had one of the highest rates of gun deaths per capita in the United States in recent years, higher than the national average. In 2021, the state saw a gun death rate of approximately 22.7 per 100,000 people. For comparison, the national average was around 14.6. That's nearly 50% higher. Communities across the state, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Las Cruces, have been grappling with violence that's touched families, schools, and neighborhoods. There have been heartbreaking stories of young people caught in crossfire, domestic violence incidents that turned deadly, and preventable accidents involving children. These tragedies created a groundswell of public demand for action. Second, there's been a massive shift in public opinion. Polling data shows that a majority of Americans across party lines support certain gun control measures like universal background checks. We're talking about 80-90% support in some polls. Even among gun owners, there's significant backing for common sense reforms. So politicians in New Mexico saw an opportunity to respond to what their constituents were asking for. Third, there's the political landscape. New Mexico's state government is currently controlled by Democrats who generally favor stricter gun regulations. The governor, the state legislature, they've had the political will and the votes to push this through. And they did. But here's the thing, this isn't happening in a vacuum. New Mexico is joining a growing list of states that have enacted comprehensive gun control laws in recent years. States like California, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, they've all implemented similar measures. On the flip side, states like Texas, Florida, and Missouri have gone in the opposite direction, loosening gun restrictions and expanding gun rights. So we're seeing a real divide in America, a state-by-state patchwork of wildly different gun laws, and that's creating all kinds of legal, political, and practical complications. There's also the national conversation. Every time there's a high-profile mass shooting, and sadly they happen far too often, the debate over gun control explodes. Parkland, Uvalde, Buffalo, Highland Park, Las Vegas. Each tragedy reignites the argument, do we need stricter laws or do we need better enforcement of existing laws? Do guns make us safer or do they make us more vulnerable? It's an emotionally charged, deeply personal issue for millions of Americans. New Mexico's legislators looked at all of this, the data, the public sentiment, the national trends, the tragedies, and decided to act. Whether you agree with their approach or not, you have to understand they believe they're saving lives. Now let's talk about why this matters. And I don't just mean for people living in New Mexico, I mean for all of us, especially young people. First, precedent. When one state makes a bold move like this, others pay attention. New Mexico's laws could become a blueprint for other states considering similar legislation. We've already seen this pattern with marijuana legalization, minimum wage increases, and voting rights laws. States watch each other, learn from each other, and sometimes copy each other. So if New Mexico's laws are deemed successful, if gun deaths decrease, if communities feel safer, you can bet other states will follow suit. Second, your rights. Whether you're pro-gun control, or somewhere in between, these laws affect your constitutional rights. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to bear arms, but like all rights, it's not absolute. The question is, where do we draw the line? What regulations are reasonable, and what regulations go too far? These are questions that will be answered in courts, legislatures, and public forums for years to come. And your voice matters in that conversation. Third, safety. Let's be real. Gun violence impacts young people disproportionately. According to the CDC, firearms are now the leading cause of death for children and teenagers in the United States, surpassing car accidents. Let that sink in. More kids and teens are dying from guns than from any other cause. Whether it's homicides, suicides, or accidents, young people are on the front lines of this issue. Laws like New Mexico's are designed, at least in part, to protect you. Fourth, the bigger picture. This is about the kind of country we want to live in. Do we prioritize individual freedom, even if it means some level of risk? Or do we prioritize collective safety, even if it means some restrictions on personal liberty? This is a fundamental philosophical debate, and it's playing out in real time across America. Your generation will inherit the consequences of these decisions, so it's crucial that you're informed and engaged. Fifth, legal challenges. Here's where it gets really interesting. These laws are almost certainly going to be challenged in court. Gun rights groups like the National Rifle Association, the Second Amendment Foundation, and others have already signaled their intent to sue. They'll argue that New Mexico's laws violate the Second Amendment and are unconstitutional. This could go all the way to the Supreme Court. And speaking of the Supreme Court, recent rulings have been favorable to gun rights advocates. In 2022, the court issued a landmark decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which struck down a New York law requiring people to show proper cause to carry a concealed handgun in public. The ruling established a new standard for evaluating gun laws, focusing on whether restrictions are consistent with America's historical tradition of firearm regulation. This has emboldened challenges to gun control laws across the country. So New Mexico's laws are going to be tested, and the outcome could reshape gun policy nationwide. Let me give you some real-life context and data, because this stuff matters. We're not just talking about abstract policy debates. We're talking about lives. Example one, Florida. After the Parkland school shooting in 2018, Florida, a traditionally gun-friendly state, passed a red flag law. In the first year alone, courts issued over 1,800 risk protection orders. Law enforcement officials credited the law with preventing several potential mass shootings and numerous suicides. One case involved a man who had stockpiled weapons and was making threats online. His guns were temporarily removed, and he received mental health treatment. Example two, Missouri. On the flip side, Missouri repealed its permit to purchase law in 2007, which had required background checks for all handgun sales. Researchers found that in the years following the repeal, Missouri's firearm homicide rate increased by 25% and firearm suicides increased by 16%. This suggests that loosening gun laws can have real consequences. The numbers don't lie. According to the CDC, there were over 48,000 gun deaths in the United States in 2021. That includes homicides, suicides, and accidental deaths. Breaking it down, roughly 54% were suicides, 43% were homicides, and 3% were accidental or undetermined. Gun violence costs the U.S. economy an estimated $280 billion annually when you factor in medical costs, legal costs, lost productivity, and quality of life impacts. But here's the counterpoint. There are an estimated 400 million firearms in civilian hands in the United States. The vast majority of gun owners never commit a crime. They use their firearms responsibly for self-defense, hunting, sport shooting, and recreation. Defensive gun use is hard to quantify, but some estimates suggest there are anywhere from 60,000 to over 2 million defensive gun uses per year, depending on the study. So guns do save lives too. The question is, how do we balance those realities? How do we reduce gun deaths while respecting the rights of responsible gun owners? That's the challenge, and it's not an easy one. Question one, does gun control actually reduce gun violence, or does it just restrict law-abiding citizens? This is the heart of the debate. Supporters of gun control point to data from countries like Australia, which implemented strict gun laws after a mass shooting in 1996 and saw dramatic reductions in gun deaths. They also point to studies showing that states with stricter gun laws tend to have lower rates of gun deaths. But opponents argue that correlation doesn't equal causation, that other factors like economics, culture, and law enforcement play bigger roles. They also point out that criminals, by definition, don't follow laws, so new regulations only burden responsible gun owners. Who's right? Honestly, it depends on which studies you look at, how you interpret the data, and what you believe about human nature and government's role in society. There's no simple answer, and that's frustrating, I know, but it's the truth. Question 2, are red flag laws a necessary tool for preventing violence, or do they violate due process? Red flag laws allow courts to temporarily remove firearms from individuals deemed a danger to themselves or others. The process typically includes a hearing where evidence is presented and the person in question has the right to contest the order. Supporters say this is a critical tool for preventing tragedies. Critics say it can be abused, that it allows people to be stripped of their rights based on accusations without being charged with a crime, and that it could be used vindictively in domestic disputes or personal conflicts. The due process question is real. The Fifth and 14th Amendments guarantee that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So the question is, do red flag laws provide sufficient due process protections? Courts will ultimately decide, but it's a legitimate concern that deserves serious consideration. Question 3, can we trust the government with more power over gun ownership? This is a question that resonates deeply, especially in America, where distrust of government is baked into our founding principles. The Second Amendment itself was written in part as a check on government tyranny. The idea was that an armed populace could resist an oppressive government. So when the government seeks to regulate or restrict gun ownership, some people see it as the first step down a slippery slope toward authoritarianism. On the other hand, proponents of gun control argue that we already accept reasonable restrictions on rights all the time. Free speech doesn't protect threats or fraud. The right to vote doesn't mean you can vote twice. So why should the Second Amendment be treated as absolute? They argue that sensible regulations make society safer without threatening democracy. Question 4, what about mental health? This one comes up every time there's a mass shooting. People say it's not a gun problem, it's a mental health problem. And you know what? They're partly right. Mental health is a huge piece of the puzzle. The majority of gun deaths are suicides, which are directly related to mental health crises. And many mass shooters have shown signs of psychological distress or had histories of concerning behavior. But here's the thing. Mental health and gun policy aren't mutually exclusive. We can and should do both. We should invest in mental health services, reduce stigma, make treatment accessible and affordable. And we can implement policies that keep guns out of the hands of people in crisis. It's not either or, it's both and. Question 5, what about enforcement? This is a practical question that doesn't get enough attention. Passing laws is one thing, enforcing them is another. Universal background checks only work if they're actually conducted. Red flag laws only work if law enforcement and family members use them. Safe storage laws only work if they're enforced and people comply. Enforcement requires resources, funding, training, personnel. It also requires political will, and it requires public cooperation. If people don't believe in the laws or if they think they're unjust, compliance will be low. So the success of New Mexico's laws will depend not just on what's written on paper, but on how they're implemented in practice. Question 6, what happens if someone needs a gun for self-defense right now? This is a real concern, especially for people in dangerous situations, domestic violence victims, people living in high crime areas, people facing credible threats. A 7-day waiting period could be a lifetime for someone in danger. That's why some states have exceptions to waiting periods for people who can demonstrate immediate need. Whether New Mexico's law includes such exceptions is an important detail. Critics also point out that gun control laws can disproportionately impact marginalized communities. Permitting requirements requirements, fees, and bureaucratic processes can be barriers for low-income people, people of color, and others who already face systemic obstacles. So even well-intentioned laws can have unintended consequences. So where do we go from here? What happens next in New Mexico and beyond? Immediate legal challenges. As I mentioned, gun rights groups are gearing up to challenge these laws in court. Expect lawsuits to be filed within weeks, if not days. These cases will work their way through the state and federal court systems, potentially reaching the U.S. Supreme Court. The legal battles could take years. Implementation and enforcement. New Mexico's government will begin the process of putting these laws into action. That means training law enforcement, setting up systems for background checks and red flag petitions, creating public awareness campaigns about safe storage requirements, and figuring out how to handle compliance and violations. This is a massive logistical undertaking. Public response. There will be protests, rallies, town halls, and public debates. Gun rights advocates will mobilize. Gun control advocates will celebrate and push for even more. The public discourse will be intense, emotional, and probably divisive. That's democracy in action, for better or worse. Political repercussions. Elections have consequences, and this issue will be front and center in New Mexico's next election cycle. Candidates will be judged on their stance on these laws. Some politicians will be voted out, others will be elevated, and the political landscape will shift. National ripple effects. As I said earlier, other states are watching. If New Mexico's laws are successful, if gun deaths decrease, if communities feel safer, if the legal challenges fail, expect other states to follow. If the laws fail, if they're struck down in court, if gun deaths don't decrease, if there's massive public backlash, expect other states to take note of that too. Your role. And here's where you come in. If you're a teenager or young adult, you might not be able to vote yet, or maybe you just became eligible, but you have a voice. You can educate yourself on these issues. You can talk to your friends and family. You can participate in your community. You can contact your representatives. You can organize, protest, advocate. Your generation is the future, and the decisions being made today will shape your world tomorrow. Don't underestimate your power. The Parkland students showed what's possible when young people stand up and demand change. Whether you support gun control or oppose it, whether you think New Mexico went too far or not far enough, your voice matters. All right, let's bring this home. New Mexico just passed some of the most comprehensive gun control legislation in the country. Universal background checks, red flag laws, waiting periods, safe storage requirements, assault weapon bans. It's a big deal. It's happening right now, and it's going to have consequences, legal, political, social, that we'll be grappling with for years. Here's what I want you to take away from this. This issue is complicated. There are no easy answers. People on both sides of the debate care deeply. They want safety. They want freedom. They want to protect their families and communities. The question is, how do we achieve those goals? I don't have all the answers. Nobody does. But I do know this. Informed, engaged citizens make better decisions than ignorant or apathetic ones. So educate yourself, read studies, listen to perspectives you disagree with, think critically, ask hard questions. Don't just accept what you're told by me, by politicians, by anyone. Dig deeper. And remember, democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires participation. So participate. Vote when you can. Speak up. Make your voice heard. If you found this video valuable, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos on important issues like this. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Do you support New Mexico's new gun laws? Do you think they'll work? What would you do differently? I want to hear from you. And share this video with your friends, your family, anyone who cares about these issues. The more people who are informed, the better our conversations and our decisions will be. All right, that's it for today. I'm Daniel Davis. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and I'll see you in the next one.